The streets of Athens shimmered beneath the sun, marble columns rising like frozen waves of stone, catching and reflecting the brilliance of a city that claimed to be the jewel of the world. To the eye, it was beauty. Statues of gods and heroes, theaters filled with music, philosophers walking in measured steps while arguing about truth and virtue. But in the shadows of this golden city, away from the painted temples and proud processions, lived stories too fragile to carve in marble. This is the story of one such life, a boy who came to Athens not as a citizen nor a free man, but as something in between a possession and a prize. His name was Callias, though in time even his name would become less his own. His story begins in innocence, with the wide eyes of a child staring at a city that promised beauty but gave him only chains. Before we begin, I want to invite you, if stories like these capture your curiosity and stir something deep within, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring forgotten voices like Callias's back to life. Now, let's step into the world of Athens, in the age of glory, and uncover the hidden cost of its brilliance. Athens during the 5th century BCE was a city alive with contradictions. The Parthenon gleamed white against the blue of the Attic sky. Philosophers debated virtue in the agora. Playwrights staged tragedies that questioned the very nature of fate. And yet, woven beneath this golden cloth was a darker thread, the market of human bodies, the trade in boys and girls brought from the far edges of the Greek world, taken as slaves, entertainers, and companions for those whose wealth demanded both power and pleasure. Callias's earliest memory was not of Athens itself, but of the sea voyage that carried him there. He remembered the salt sting in his eyes, the rope that cut against his wrists, the smell of oil and sweat mingling with the cries of other children. Some were like him, taken from smaller cities under Athenian control, others from foreign coasts where Greek soldiers raided in search of spoils. Callias was perhaps 9 or 10 when the ship brought him into the Piraeus harbor, where cranes lifted cargo and merchants shouted prices. He was not cargo of grain or pottery, but flesh, another boy destined for sale. The slave market was loud and cruel, a theater of humiliation where the young and strong were displayed like livestock. Men in fine robes touched arms and legs, examined teeth, judged the softness of skin as if selecting fruit. For a boy like Callias, slim and graceful, the bidding was swift. He was bought not for hard labor but for something else, a role less spoken of, whispered in symposium halls, where men drank wine and spoke of philosophy while indulging in pleasures hidden from polite conversation. The man who purchased Callias was wealthy, one of those Athenians who could afford to keep a household filled with attendants. He was not cruel in the way some masters were. There were no beatings for disobedience, no whips waiting at the edge of every mistake. But kindness was not the right word either. What he gave Callias was comfort and adornment. Soft robes, perfumed oil for the hair, food rich enough to fill a child's belly. Yet every gift carried a chain, invisible but tight. Callias learned quickly that his role was not to labor in fields, but to please, to charm, to be a living ornament in the house of his master. Athens was a city of masks. In the daylight, it boasted of its democracy, its freedom, its respect for reason. But at night, behind closed doors, the masks slipped, revealing hungers that polite society pretended did not exist. Callias was taken into the world of the symposium, a gathering where men reclined on couches, drinking from silver cups, discussing politics, war, and philosophy while music played and dancers performed. At first, he was a servant, pouring wine, fanning the guests, listening in silence as men debated whether virtue could be taught or whether the soul was immortal. He did not understand the weight of these words, but he memorized the rhythm of their voices, the way laughter swelled when wine loosened their tongues. In time, though, he was not simply the boy with the jug of wine. He was taught to sing softly, to dance, to charm with glances, to move in ways that blurred the line between servant and spectacle. And then came the other role, the role that marked him not as a child but as something else. For in those rooms, beneath the smoke of lamps and the scent of spilled wine, the men reached for him. They whispered his name as if it belonged to them, and he learned to endure the weight of their desires. Callias was not the only one. The symposium was a place where beauty was currency, where youth was both praised and consumed. Other boys like him floated through these rooms, each with their own story, their own silence. Some grew hardened, learning to trade wit for favor, using charm as a shield. Others broke quietly, their eyes hollow long before their bodies were grown. Callias hovered somewhere between, still clinging to fragments of hope, still imagining that one day, perhaps, he might walk free in the agora as more than a shadow. To understand Callias's tragedy, one must understand Athens itself. It was a city of ideals, where Socrates questioned the meaning of justice, where Plato dreamed of perfect forms. Yet in these same streets, men bought and sold lives, excusing it with philosophy. They spoke of beauty as divine, of love between men as noble, and yet beneath these lofty words, boys like Callias were caught in the tangle of desire and power. Athens celebrated youth in art and poetry, the statues of Kuroi, the verses of poets praising the fleeting beauty of adolescence. But in celebrating, it also consumed, as if beauty existed only to be taken and lost. Callias became both symbol and victim of this paradox. Adored in public, discarded in private. His worth measured not by who he was, but by the glow of his skin, the grace of his movement, the way he filled a room with silent longing. As the years passed, Callias grew older. He was no longer the small boy brought trembling from the market. His limbs lengthened, his face sharpened with the beauty of youth reaching its height. For some, this made him all the more desirable. For others, it marked the beginning of his decline. For in Athens, the cruel truth was that beauty was valued most when it was young, fragile, just on the cusp of growth. At 15, Callias was already beginning to see the change. Where once he had been the prized adornment of symposium halls, he now shared space with younger boys brought in from the markets. He saw in their wide eyes the same fear he had once carried. He wanted to whisper comfort, to tell them they were not alone, but his own silence weighed heavier with each passing season. He began to understand that his place was not permanent, that he was part of a cycle that repeated endlessly. The city demanded its pleasures, and there would always be new faces to replace the old. Athens, for all its talk of eternity, devoured the youth of its slaves like fire consumes dry wood. Callias would sometimes steal moments for himself. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he slipped onto the roof and looked out over the city. The Acropolis loomed above, torches flickering around the Parthenon. He could hear faint echoes from the theater, where tragedies were performed under the stars. He dreamed that perhaps one day he might step onto that stage, not as a servant or concubine, but as a free man telling stories that would outlast him. But the dream was fragile. Each morning, the chain of reality pulled him back. He was reminded again and again. He was not a citizen, not even a man in the eyes of Athens. He was property, a possession to be used until no longer desired. Yet Athens was changing too. The Peloponnesian War loomed, casting shadows over the city's pride. Soldiers marched, alliances shifted, and the city's wealth strained under the weight of endless conflict. In such times, the pleasures of the symposium grew both more desperate and more cruel. Men who feared death tomorrow sought to consume all the beauty they could today. For Callias, this meant longer nights, rougher hands, fewer moments of gentleness. It was in this crucible that he began to break, not in sudden collapse, but in quiet erosion. His laughter grew hollow, his songs less bright. Inside, he wondered if Athens even remembered him as a person, or if he had become nothing more than a fleeting shadow in a city too busy proclaiming its greatness to notice the lives it crushed beneath. The years in Athens unfolded like the slow turning of a great bronze gear, each season leaving its mark not just upon the marble walls of temples, but upon the souls of those who lived within the city's embrace. For Callias, the passage from boyhood to youth carried him deeper into the world of desire and deception, where pleasure was woven with peril, and each choice pressed him closer to his fate. The symposium became his true classroom. While other young Athenians learned geometry from Euclid's followers or rhetoric from sophists who could twist words into swords, Callias absorbed his lessons in perfumed halls lit by the glow of oil lamps. Reclining on silken couches beside men whose names echoed in the assembly, he learned how power operated not through noble ideals, but through the whispered promises traded between wine cups. The first time he was chosen to accompany a general returning from campaign, he felt a surge of pride, as though the city itself had lifted him into the ranks of those who mattered. Draped in new robes, his hair scented with oils, he rode in a chariot beside a man whose victories were praised in the agora. Crowds cheered, but their eyes slid past him, seeing only the general. Callias was a shadow at the edge of glory. Yet in that shadow, he realized the strange advantage of invisibility. He could listen, observe, and learn. Athens was an empire, yet fragile. Tribute ships from distant islands arrived in Piraeus, bearing silver and grain, but also resentment. In the smoky corners of banquets, Callias overheard men speak of uprisings, of city-states straining against the Athenian yoke, and always the refrain money. Silver funded ships, silver bought loyalty, silver carved the future. Without it, even the proudest democracy would crumble. Callias himself was part of this economy of flesh and coin. His beauty was currency, his silence a form of payment. He learned quickly that to survive, he must never reveal too much of himself. Instead, he reflected back what others wished to see. To the philosopher, he was the eager listener. To the general, he was loyal adornment. To the poet, he was muse. Yet beneath each mask, the true Callias, the boy who once dreamed of simply walking free among the olive groves, slipped further into obscurity. There were moments when he almost forgot himself entirely. At one symposium, the poet Agathon recited verses about love as divine madness, and Alcibiades, drunk and glittering with arrogance, declared that beauty gave men the power to rule even without laws. Callias, reclining at the foot of a couch, felt the eyes of half the room upon him. They admired his form, the turn of his neck, the curve of his lips. Yet none asked what lay within his heart. He was sculpture, not soul. As the years stretched on, he began to notice the subtle shifts. The freshness of youth that had once drawn patrons with ease was no longer unchallenged. New boys, younger and unscarred by years of use, appeared in the circles he once dominated. He smiled, he played his part, but inside he felt the creeping chill of irrelevance. Athens adored beauty, but it adored it briefly, and then discarded it like a garland after a feast. Still, Callias was not without cunning. He used what influence he had gained to forge quieter connections. While others sought fame in the assembly, he cultivated servants, scribes, and those who carried messages through the labyrinth of the city. He knew who met whom in the starlit courtyards, which generals whispered treason, which philosophers accepted bribes to sway their arguments. Knowledge became his hidden armor, even as his outward radiance dimmed. Yet knowledge was a dangerous possession. One evening, after entertaining a wealthy patron who was himself entangled in secret dealings, Callias found himself followed through the narrow streets. Shadows slipped behind him, silent but close. He ducked into a shrine, clutching a small offering bowl, pretending piety until the footsteps passed. That night, he lay awake, realizing the peril of knowing too much. He was no longer merely a concubine. He was a man carrying the weight of truths that could topple reputations. Meanwhile, Athens itself shifted toward turbulence. The Peloponnesian War dragged on, bleeding the city of men and resources. Callias watched as once magnificent processions grew thinner, sacrifices more desperate. Where once the Acropolis echoed with hymns, now it was filled with the cries of widows. Even the symposiums grew darker. The laughter was louder, more frantic, as though men drank to drown the reality of decline. In this atmosphere, Callias's own role transformed. No longer merely the ornament of leisure, he became a confidant of sorts, a vessel for secrets whispered in exhaustion. Men unburdened themselves to him not because they loved him, but because he was safe. He had no place in the assembly, no army to command, no estate to inherit. What he heard, he carried silently, and in that silence, he became indispensable to some. But indispensability is fragile when built on desire. As the city decayed, so too did Callias's security. Patrons who once showered him with gifts found their fortunes depleted. Others turned their attention to newer faces. The silks he once wore grew worn at the edges. The fine oils became rarer. The life that had seemed gilded revealed itself as precarious scaffolding. And then came the plague. It swept through Athens like a scythe, cutting down rich and poor alike. Callias nursed one of his last patrons through fever, only to watch the man's body carried to the pyre. Left with nothing, he wandered through streets filled with smoke and lamentation, where even the marble statues seemed to weep. He thought of leaving the city, of vanishing into some island village, but where would he go? He had no family, no trade. His body had been his livelihood, and it was a coin that lost value with each passing year. Yet fate, cruel and capricious, was not finished with him. In the aftermath of plague, when desperation reigned, Callias was summoned once more to a gathering, this time not of laughter, but of strategy. The city's leaders, gaunt and weary, still clung to power. They needed comfort, distraction, someone to remind them, even for a few hours, of the world before ruin. And so Callias returned to the symposium, thinner, older, but still bearing the remnants of a beauty that had once captured the city. As he reclined among men who plotted the city's uncertain future, he realized the full shape of his life. He had been present at the heights of Athens, when its philosophers dreamed of immortality, when its temples gleamed white against the sky. He had seen its glory, and now he watched its unraveling. And through it all, he himself was both participant and victim, celebrated and forgotten, used and discarded. What remained to him was memory, memory of a boy standing in the shadow of the Parthenon, dreaming of freedom, memory of laughter and music drifting from lamplit halls, memory of touches that blurred the line between affection and possession, and perhaps, above all, memory of the truth he had learned in the city of wisdom, that beneath marble and philosophy, beneath empire and rhetoric, lay the same hunger, the same cruelty, the same fleeting grasp at beauty before time claimed all. The city of Athens never truly slept. Even in decline, It hummed with restless energy. Markets where hollow-eyed merchants hawked whatever remained of their goods, temples where priests pleaded with indifferent gods, and taverns where men drowned their sorrows in wine. But for Callias, the nights no longer sang as they once did. What had once been a stage of laughter, poetry, and youth had become a theater of ghosts. His reflection told him the truth that whispers could not. The boy of bright skin and radiant eyes, the one who had once drawn sighs at every gathering, was gone. The mirror now showed a man whose beauty had been weathered by years of use and silent suffering. Fine lines traced the corners of his eyes. His lips no longer held the effortless curve of innocence, and his body, once flawless, bore the faint marks of age and fever. He was not yet old, but in a city that worshipped perfection, he might as well have been invisible. The plague had left scars not only on flesh but on spirit. The great avenues where once processions carried statues of Athena now echoed with wails of mourning. Marble temples stood as monuments not of divine protection but of divine indifference. The air itself smelled of smoke and decay, as pyres burned endlessly beyond the walls. And yet, amidst this ruin, the symposium still flickered on, like desperate flames refusing to die. Callias found himself summoned less often now, but when he was, it was not for desire. It was for comfort, though not the kind he once gave. Men wanted someone who remembered, someone who had seen the golden days, who could remind them through presence alone of a time before rot set in. Callias became a living relic, a reminder of beauty long past. At first, he tried to play the role. He oiled his hair, perfumed his robes, and painted his face with faint touches of youth. But no paint can turn back the river of time. He saw it in the way eyes slid past him, drawn instead to newer boys brought into the halls, trembling with the same mixture of pride and fear he had once known. Their laughter was lighter, their beauty untarnished. He envied them, but in that envy he also pitied them, for he knew the path awaiting them. Athens itself seemed to mirror his decline. The city that once claimed to be the school of Hellas, the beacon of philosophy and democracy, was now riddled with corruption. Generals sold loyalties, oracles sold visions, and men in the assembly argued not for justice but for survival. Callias, in his quiet role as ornament and confidant, heard it all: the plots to betray allies, the bribes hidden in temple treasuries, the despair of leaders who saw no end to the war. Sometimes he thought of leaving. Perhaps there were villages untouched by war, places where anonymity might grant him peace. But the truth was harsher. Callias had no skills beyond the life he had been thrust into. He was not a farmer, not a craftsman, not even a soldier. His body had been both his prison and his weapon, and now, as its luster faded, he was disarmed. The decline of his fortunes came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow dimming of a lamp. First it was the gifts, fewer garlands, fewer coins slipped into his hands. Then it was the silks replaced with simpler cloth. Finally, it was the summons themselves. Weeks passed without call, then months. He wandered the streets like any other citizen, blending into crowds that once parted for him. He discovered something bitter in that anonymity. For the first time, men looked at him not with desire, but with indifference. He was simply another figure among the masses, no longer luminous. The city that had consumed his youth now discarded him as it discarded broken pottery, useful once, forgotten now. Yet he could not resist the pull of memory. He lingered near the symposium halls at night, listening to faint laughter drifting from within. Sometimes he caught glimpses of the new favorites, their faces alight with the glow of being wanted. He would turn away quickly, but the ache followed him home. Home, though even that word rang hollow. His chamber was no longer perfumed with oils or adorned with fine linens. It was bare, cold, a space where silence pressed heavily. He lived now on scraps of charity, the occasional kindness of an old patron who had not yet forgotten him. Hunger gnawed at him, but worse than hunger was emptiness. And yet he was not entirely alone. There were others like him, men and boys who had once basked in the light of favor, now cast into shadow. They gathered sometimes in corners of the agora, a silent brotherhood of the discarded. They did not speak much, for words only deepened the wound, but in their eyes was the recognition of shared ruin. Some turned to theft, others to beggary. A few simply vanished, swallowed by alleys or the sea. Callias endured. He endured because he had no choice, because survival had been branded into him since youth. But endurance is not the same as living. Each day felt like a repetition, a cycle of wandering, remembering, and regretting, until one evening when he was summoned again. The messenger found him near the Kerameikos, staring at the rows of graves where plague victims lay. The boy, younger than Callias had ever been when he entered this world, handed him a folded tablet. It bore the seal of a man Callias once knew well, a general older now, diminished by losses in war. The message was brief. Come tonight. Callias hesitated. He could refuse. He could break free from the cycle, walk away into obscurity. But something in him stirred, a final ember of pride, or perhaps desperation. He bathed in cold water, combed what remained of his once golden hair, and dressed in the cleanest robe he still possessed. The symposium was smaller than he remembered, the couches fewer, the wine thinner. The men gathered there were gaunt, their laughter forced. They looked at Callias not with hunger but with something stranger, pity perhaps or unease. Yet still they welcomed him. He reclined as he once had, listening to talk of war, of Sparta, of the city's dwindling hope. And for a moment, in the flicker of lamplight, he felt a ghost of the past. The music played softly, the wine warmed his lips, and he could almost believe he had returned to the days of youth. But it was an illusion, fragile and fleeting. When he caught sight of his reflection in a bronze cup, he saw not the boy who once dazzled Athens, but a weary man clinging to memories. The general spoke kindly to him that night, thanking him for his presence, as if Callias himself were a relic of a more beautiful time. And Callias realized the truth. He was no longer desired, but remembered. His role had shifted from lover to living memory, a symbol of what Athens once was and would never be again. After that night, the summons ceased entirely. Winter came. The city shivered under thin cloaks, grain prices soared, and whispers of betrayal thickened. Callias grew weaker, his body worn by hunger and cold. He spent his days wandering the streets, gazing at temples he once entered with pride, now barred to him. Sometimes he sat beneath the Parthenon staring up at the goddess who had watched over his entire life. Her marble face remained serene, untouched by plague or war, while everything human around her crumbled. In his final days, Callias became almost invisible. He walked unnoticed among crowds, slept in corners, and spoke to no one. The once beloved concubine of Athens had become a ghost long before his body died. And yet, in that silence, he found a strange clarity. He saw the city as it truly was, not the shining jewel of philosophy and art, but a place where beauty was consumed and discarded, where flesh and spirit alike were sacrificed on the altar of ambition. He had lived as ornament, as possession, as memory. But in the end, he was simply human, fragile, temporary, forgotten. One morning, when the sky was the color of ash and the wind carried the smell of smoke from distant pyres, Callias lay down near the steps of a temple. No one noticed him. People passed by, hurrying about their business, blind to the figure curled in shadow. His breath slowed, his body yielded, and in that quiet surrender, his story ended. The city did not mourn him. Athens moved on, as cities always do, chasing new wars, new pleasures, new beauties to consume. But somewhere in the memory of those who had once known him, the echo of Callias lingered, a reminder that even in the city of wisdom, even in the age of gods and glory, there were lives lived and lost in silence. And perhaps in that echo, Callias achieved what he never could in life. Not immortality carved in marble, not fame written in speeches, but the faint, enduring whisper of a truth too often forgotten, that behind every monument of empire lies a fragile human heart. The years crept on, and Callias's body betrayed him long before his spirit admitted defeat. His once lithe form, prized in the chambers of Athenian elites, now stooped with age. His hair, once a river of black curls, had thinned and turned the color of ash. His skin, once glowing from oils and perfumes, bore the scars of a life spent pleasing others, and of nights when wine was the only shield against loneliness. Athens, too, was no longer the city he had once known. The marble facades still gleamed under the sun, but the glory had dimmed. The air carried more whispers of loss than hymns of victory. The city that had defied Persia, that had raised the Parthenon, that had been home to Socrates and Euripides, was now bound in uneasy submission to stronger powers. The golden mask was cracking, and behind it lay decay. Callias saw it all. He wandered the streets like a shadow, unseen by those who once would have coveted him. He passed by workshops where artisans still carved gods into stone, but fewer eyes lingered on his face now. To the young men, he was nothing more than another weary elder. To the courtesans and servants, he was a relic, one who carried too many stories and too many ghosts. Yet within him still burned the need to belong, to matter. And so he clung to memories of when he did. The Peloponnesian War had left Athens fractured, humiliated by Sparta. Then came the rise of Thebes, then Macedon under Philip and Alexander, and at last the looming shadow of Rome. Each new power stripped Athens a little further of its pride. Callias watched senators and philosophers alike bow to foreign rulers, their words gilded but their spines bent. The symposiums where he had once been paraded as a jewel of desire were quieter now. The laughter of drunken men no longer echoed with the same bold confidence. It was muted, uncertain. Athenian citizens muttered about taxes imposed by conquerors, about sons conscripted into armies not their own. For Callias, it was an uncanny mirror of his own existence. Just as Athens had been a beacon of freedom yet built on slavery and exploitation, he too had once glittered in silks while bound by invisible chains. And now, as Athens bowed before greater powers, so too did Callias bow before age, no longer free, no longer desired, his worth measured only by what once was. In his later years, Callias found himself taken in by an elderly Athenian widow, a woman named Lysandra who had once attended the same feasts as he. She was no longer wealthy, her estate sold off piece by piece, yet she remembered him with kindness. To her, Callias was not merely a concubine, but a living memory of a city's golden age. In her modest home, he found a strange kind of peace. No longer was he painted in perfumes or made to dance beneath drunken eyes. Instead, he told stories. Lysandra's grandchildren would sit at his feet, wide-eyed, as he described the festivals of Dionysus, the torchlit races through the streets, the voices of philosophers arguing under olive trees. It was then, in the role of storyteller rather than ornament, that Callias discovered a gentler purpose. Though his body was failing, his voice could still weave worlds. Perhaps he thought this was the truest freedom he had ever known. But even this respite could not last forever. At night, Callias often walked the streets alone, drifting toward the Parthenon or the marketplace. There, he would linger among strangers, listening to them barter, laugh, argue. He sometimes caught fragments of debates about Rome or about whether the gods had abandoned Athens. Each word carried weight, yet for him, they blurred together like echoes of a song long out of tune. He would close his eyes and see again the symposiums of his youth. Alcibiades raising his cup, Socrates smiling faintly at some hidden truth, young men glancing at him with envy or lust. He remembered the taste of sweet wine, the sting of betrayal, the endless cycle of pleasure bought with pain. And then, inevitably, the faces of those who had used him, who had claimed him, who had left him behind. Some were now dust, their names fading even from memory. Yet Callias endured, and in that endurance, there was both triumph and tragedy. One evening, the city held a modest festival in honor of Dionysus. It was nothing compared to the grand processions of old, but torches still burned, music still played, and dancers filled the square. Callias, leaning on a staff, joined the crowd. For a moment, as the firelight flickered and the air filled with song, he almost felt young again. He almost forgot the ache in his bones. He watched the dancers move with abandon, their bodies painted gold, their laughter rising into the night sky. And then, a strange thing happened. Some in the crowd began to whisper his name, not in mockery, not in pity, but in recognition. The old concubine, the one who had been there in the time of Pericles, the one who had seen Athens at its height, a living ghost of the city's memory. Children pointed him out to their parents. Elders nodded with quiet respect. For once, Callias was not an object of desire, nor a symbol of shame. He was a witness, one who carried Athens' story in his very flesh. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized what that meant. His life, twisted though it had not been in vain. For through him others remembered. Through him the golden age of Athens still flickered, however faintly. That night, Callias returned to Lyssandra's home, exhausted but strangely at peace. He lay on his modest bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. The sounds of the festival still drifted faintly through the window, laughter, drums, distant singing. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he dreamed not of chains, nor of feasts, nor of betrayal. He dreamed of the sea, the same sea that had carried him to Athens as a boy. He saw its waves, endless and shimmering, and he felt no fear. When dawn came, Lysandra found him still. His staff leaned against the wall, his face calm. He was gone. Time marched on. Athens continued its slow decline, its name surviving more as legend than as reality. Rome claimed its marble, its statues, its philosophers. Tourists from across the empire came to marvel at ruins and to hear the descendants of thinkers who once debated under the Acropolis. Yet, in the quiet corners of the city, some still spoke of Callias. Not as a hero, not as a philosopher, but as a man whose life mirrored the fate of Athens itself. Brilliant, desired, broken, yet unforgettable. His story, like the city's, was a warning and a lesson. Beauty fades, power crumbles, but the memory of how we lived, of how we endured, lingers on. And so, the tragic life of Callias ends where it began. As part of a larger story, one written not only in the chambers of the powerful, but in the hearts of those forced to live in their shadows. His tale is not simply of one man, but of a city, a civilization, and the truth that even in golden ages, there are those who bear invisible chains. His name may fade, but the questions his life raises will not. Was Athens truly free when it bound others in silence? Was Callias truly powerless when his memory outlived his masters? Perhaps the answer lies in you, the listener, the keeper of his story now. If this journey through the hidden corners of Athens has stirred something within you, if Callias's life made you think of beauty, of power, of loss, and of the stories history tries to hide, then I invite you to carry his memory forward. Like this video so others can discover it. Subscribe to the channel to join me in uncovering more forgotten lives, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because just as Athens lives on through those who remember it, so too do these stories survive when you help keep them alive.